Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining us today for this important conversation about Black History Month in Poland. My name is Bolaji Balogun. I'm a Living Fellow at the University of Sheffield. In the recent momentum of the Black Lives Matter across the world and most especially in Poland, Margaret and I thought it would be good to actually follow up with this kind of conversation that we're about to have about Black History Month in Poland. What does it actually mean to Black people living in Poland, and what does it even mean to the history of Black Europe generally? So to help us to have a better understanding of what this actually means generally, we've got three interesting speakers, I would say, who actually have really first-hand experience of what Black history means in America and what it actually means in Europe generally. To start off with, we've got Stephen Small, who is a professor of African Diaspora Studies at the University of California in Berkeley, and a scholar on Black Europe. Stephen has taught at universities in England, the United States, the Netherlands, and also directed international programs in Zimbabwe, Brazil, France, and Spain. So Stephen works cut across. Stephen has actually mentored and advised students and community researchers from Black community organizations across nations. His most recent book, which I'm going to be engaging with during our conversation, 20 Questions and Answers on Black Europe, has been described as a pioneering work in Europeanizing Black studies. Stephen currently researches the legacy of imperialism in Black Europe, which he's going to be sharing with us shortly. So Margaret, over to you.
Thanks, Bolaji. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up at this event. As Bolaji said, we will be moderating it. My name is Margaret Ohia-Nowak. I'm a diversity trainer, an anti-racist activist, and also an academic based in Poland. And I'm very pleased to welcome our guests here. The second one is Lexie Ajibade-Tillman. She's a Polish-Nigerian American entrepreneur. She's a social activist, and she's a rising voice for the racial prejudice experienced by people of color in Poland. Lexie's activism started during her career as a non-commissioned officer with the United States Army, where she pursued fair treatment for military personnel, their family members, and base civilians, regardless of race, color, gender, religion, age, disability, and national origin. Lexie currently engages in community outreach projects with the objective to increase awareness of racial discrimination and promote tolerance in Poland. Welcome, Lexie. And the third guest of ours is Larry Olomofe, who is the former deputy head and advisor on combating racism and xenophobia at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. He is a graduate of Oxford, Cambridge, and the New School for Social Research in New York. Larry has worked for more than 25 years on issues of social justice, equity, and non-discrimination, with posts in academia, national NGOs, and with ODR. He's a trainer on issues of diversity and inclusion, workplace sensitivity, and non-discrimination, including international and national legal frameworks. Larry is currently the executive director and co-founder of People of African Descent Link, PADLink, based in Warsaw, in Poland. Additionally, he is the founder and manager of Cosmodernity Consultants, also based in Warsaw. Hello, Larry. It's a pleasure to have you here.
All right, thanks very much, Margaret. So in order to have a better structure for our discussion tonight, so I will start the discussion with Stephen to tell us a bit about the history of Black History Month, the way it's actually moved from America into Europe. And then later on, Margaret will be engaging with Lexie and Larry on what actually Black history means in Poland. So to have a better understanding of what's going on, Margaret and I will be engaging with these three speakers for about half an hour or so, if not longer. And then later on, audience can come in with their questions. So in the meantime, if you have any questions that you want us to put to anyone on the panel, please key in your questions in the chat box below, and we will try our best to group those questions together and put them through to our panel during the Q&A section.
Having grown up in America, Black History Month is the month of February. It's massive. And coming back to Poland and not seeing its existence anywhere, it leaves a void. I would love if Polish African Americans, or I don't know, Polish Black people or Black Polish people of African descent could feel the joy that it is to celebrate our people and their accomplishments. I believe that there are notable ones already. I think that a lot of even Polish people feel pride. I don't know if you guys know, but a few weeks ago, BBC ran a special on August Brown. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. And I got this message from Polish people, my father's friends, like the genre of people that sent this message to me was massive. My brother's in America, so felt that, hey, I saw this. He's Black and he was in Poland, and this is just a massive things that they felt that I should have celebrated. And I would like for all Black people in Poland to have a time where we can celebrate our impact on Europe, on our ancestors' impact on what we do today. It's interesting, earlier I was doing a little bit of research on Black History Month, and I spoke with Bolaji about it, and the only thing that him and I could find happening in Poland were US soldiers celebrating Black History Month. And in Poland, regardless of us not having it, they did it in the month of February, because that is something that is just so normal and so natural for them. And that's something that I think our Polish population could benefit from as well.
That's very, very, very interesting, Lexie. Thanks very much for that. I think on that note, it'll be quite interesting to bring Stephen in to try and contextualize this for us in terms of its history. Stephen, can you just quickly talk us through how actually Black history emerged in the US, the way it's been used to put the struggle of Black people right to the forefront, and the way it's actually its trajectory all the way from the States into Europe, what it's actually being used for in the UK, in the Netherlands, and probably it would be good to hear your thoughts on the way in which it could be utilized in Central and Eastern Europe.
Okay, thank you very much, Bolaji. Thank you, Lexie. It's good to be here. I'm glad to see that this initiative is emerging in Poland. I think for me, it's important that we recognize Black History Month is an end in itself. It's important to have a Black History Month in every country, so it's a goal in itself. But Black History Month is also a means to an end. Black History Month should begin as a month, but it should then extend throughout the entire year, because the goal of Black History Month is to reflect and to demonstrate that many of these nations, their full history cannot be told without reference to Africa. It cannot be told across Europe without reference to the Caribbean, to the creation of the United States by Europeans, to the creation of Brazil. So Black history is world history, it's national history. And Black History Month is a way to get that going. Now, I was born and raised in Liverpool. My father's from Jamaica. And growing up in Liverpool, they told me nothing about Black people, at least nothing that was good. In all the education I got in school and museums, white people were good, missionaries, saviors, wonderful slave masters, they told me, developing Christianity and civilization. And all the Africans were needy, grateful, savage, barbarian. The women were represented as naked. So I had a very distorted, partial, biased history in which Britain and British educational system was preoccupied with its own self-interest, self-glorification, and self-goals. So in order to prevent the colonization of my mind, talking to family and Black people and communities, we look to the United States. They were our heroes because of the size of the Black population, because of Black intellectuals like Du Bois, Black activists and intellectuals like Frederick Douglass, Black anti-imperialists like Amy Jakes Garvey. We look to those people and to the United States for information. Black History Month began in the 1920s as Black History Week in the United States. It was started by the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, in the 1920s in the South. It spread across the nation. In the 1970s, Black History Week became Black History Month in the United States. And the goal was to have Black people's knowledge production, education, intellectual, analytical, artistic, creative contributions acknowledged outside of Black communities, because Black communities already knew how smart, how intelligent, how creative, how productive they were. And they wanted that information to be shared because at that time, white America oppressed, exploited, stereotyped, marginalized Black people. Black people in England began African History Month in the 1980s. And the person who started African History Month directly, there were several different people in London, but the person who's regarded as starting it is Akwaba Adesebo, who's a Ghanaian, I believe, who, in conjunction with other people, chose October because it represented key issues in Africa rather than in the diaspora. And from the 1980s, Black History Month has expanded. It's not in every city, but it's in London, it's in Liverpool, it's in Leicester, it's in Leeds. And it has an array of activities that are designed to achieve a goal in itself, to show that Black people are here, we are creative, we are intellectual, we are analytical, and we will be here forever. There is a Black History Month in Germany, which is also in October. There's a Black Achievement Month in the Netherlands. They chose Black achievement to focus on current issues rather than others. And there are emergence of Black History Month or goals in places like Italy. There are women reading poetry and developing it in Denmark and Sweden and so on. So it will expand, and Poland is important that engages with these issues and develops them too. Okay. Final couple of things. First of all, I want you to know that Black History Month is a start. It's not enough. It's a way to start putting these issues on the agenda so that they can be expanded throughout the entire year, because Black people's history, African people's history, does not occur in just 1 month. It's there every day, every week, every month, and every year. Secondly, Black History Month is about decolonizing the mind. As Lexie said, Black History Month is important for Black people, but it's also important for non-Black people. It's important for Black people to know about our achievement, our presence, our intellect, our scientific contributions, but it's also important for white people to know that, because Black people's minds have been colonized, but white people's minds have been colonized too. In England, the majority of white people think colonialism is a good thing, despite the brutality, despite the violence, despite the sexual violence. So Black History Month is for everyone, Black people, white people. It's also important that Black History Month is for immigrants to these nations so that they don't get a misrepresented history. The final thing I would say is, it seems to me that in Black History Month and Black Achievement Month in all these nations, Black women are at the forefront of all the activities. Not every single one, but it seems all the activities. And the reason that they are at the forefront is not just because there are more Black women than men in all these nations, but because Black men, even though we make some efforts to address gender, to address the particular obstacles that Black women face, we do not do enough. So Black women are far more likely to be involved in all Black history, and far more likely to be involved in Black history that looks at gender, that looks at the particular obstacles that Black women face, that looks at racist, sexist ideologies. And also Black women are far more likely to engage with issues of sexism, of homophobia, and transphobia. So I'm glad to hear this initiative is developing in Poland. I encourage you, there are vast amounts of information available online, and you can develop a program in Poland that looks at the specifics of Poland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for telling us about the tradition, the historical context of the Black History Month, and obviously for bringing up very important issues of decolonization, about intersectionality, so Black women initiatives, but also about tradition in other Western European countries still, because you said that in Poland it's starting to happen, and also this engagement today is one of the reasons why we are doing this, because we think it's important. But I do want to ask Larry about his experiences on Black History Month in Poland. How have you seen it present in Poland, and why is it so important? If you can add something to what have been said already.
So thank you for the invitation and for asking me to participate in this, I think, relevant and useful talk, and also thanking people for joining. I think Stephen said it already, but actually I feel all I can add to this is to what Lexie said and to what Stephen said was Black History Month is a platform, I would say, and a prism for which we should see Black involvement in society. I mean, before the talk, we were talking briefly about Du Bois, and one of the things that is salient from the souls of Black folk is that Black achievement, Black engagement is always invisible. It's suffused in the soil, it's suffused in the actions. And I see that too here in Poland, right? Not just in Poland, but in other Central and Eastern European countries, is that there have been Black participation in these countries. Even last year, along with a couple of other colleagues, through Padlink, we did a Black History Month event, but we looked at it through a political prism in terms of trying to address policies to combat racism and racist violence against people of color. However, just looking at cursorily through, Polish culture, you see people who are participating who are not considered to be Black per se. You have the weather woman, I don't know her name. You have Sunday Lisidebe from 2000. I remember when I first saw him playing for Poland, he was like the national hero of Poland. It was his goals that got Poland into the Euro 2000 championships, right? But when you talk about Polish culture, you just don't see it. So this notion of invisibility has to be addressed. And I think Black History Month allows us to do that by allowing us to be archaeological in our approach and to uncover Black involvement. And when I first came to Poland for work in 2009, I was working with a private communications company. And what we were trying to do was to do that excavation, to look at how China has actually participated in Poland for the past 400 or 500 years, through wars, through petitions, through all kinds of things, right? And it was quite an interesting exercise to go through to see how Black involvement in Poland has been quite central, but completely forgotten. And when we do think about Black involvement in Poland, it's about Muzin, it's about the pejoratives, it's about the racism experiences and these negativities. So I guess with Black History Month, it allows us to elevate and to applaud this involvement, as well as to show that even though Poland thinks it's a homogeneous and organic reality, it's not the case. Even during the war, you had Black resistance fighters helping in the Warsaw Uprising, during the war itself, fighting Nazis. There are Black people who were victims of the Holocaust, these hidden Black folk. And it's important to show these souls of Black folk, invoking our Du Bois metaphor quite readily. So for me, how I see Black History Month, I see it as an opportunity to push and to advocate for change at the policy level, but then at the cultural level, it's also an opportunity, not just within the month, but also beyond the month, to show that actually there have been positive Black contributions to Polish society, and that they're absorbing these contributions in a way that is just overlooked through or seen through the prisms of stereotypes. And it's important for us to challenge that.
Thanks very much for that, Larry. I think that was brilliant. Thanks very much for that talk. It's quite interesting. Now, Stephen, I just want to now and try explore one or two things that you mentioned in your book, 20 questions and answers on Black Europe. I think this might be very, very interesting for people to actually to hear. So in that book, you respond to questions about Black Europe, their history, the geography, the dimension, the politics, the struggle, and the issue that they're actually facing as citizens, not as immigrants. In exploring those things, you focus so much about these people, again, as citizens, not as immigrants to Europe or refugees to Europe. I just wonder whether you could speak a little bit more about the way you come to understand Black Europe as citizens rather than refugees or immigrants.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think this is relevant to Western Europe, it's relevant to Central Europe and to Eastern Europe, in fact, to the whole of Europe, okay? And what I argue in the book, and it's an idea I developed with my colleague and friend Kwame Nimako, who's the founder of the Black Europe Summer School in Amsterdam. What we argue is that Black people in Europe are typically presented as immigrants who are struggling to adapt and assimilate to European society, and who need the tolerance of white people because Black immigrants are recently arrived, and who should show gratitude. The idea is that Black people have come from these terrible nations that are backward and deprived, which is inaccurate, and therefore they should show gratitude. But what we argue is that this is a choice. This is not objective fact. This is a choice by white people on how to view Black people. And myself, I was born and raised in Liverpool. Liverpool has a Black population that goes back several hundred years. We have several books that have been written about that by a local Black person, Dr. Ray Costello. And what we argue is that the so-called immigrants who face problems in Britain, we Black people in Liverpool, some of us have been here for 200 years, and we face the same problems. We do not have problems of language. We do not have problems of adapting to the education system. We do not have problems of figuring out food and so on. These are delusions and myths. And so by focusing on immigrants who are adapting, and many immigrants are adapting, what white people are doing in Western Europe is blaming the victims and saying all of the problems that exist is because you people come from backward countries, you don't speak English, and we're going to help you. And we reject that. We say this is a colonized mind. And what we argue is that instead of blaming the victims, you should look at yourselves, look at white racism, look at white stereotypes, look at white belief systems. And also, instead of feeling so superior, look at the inequality in Europe, the inequality around class and gender and religion, these issues here. So working with Dr. Kwame Nimako to develop this framework, what I write in the book is that instead of focusing on immigrants, we should focus on citizens and recognize that Black people, the vast majority of Black people in Europe are citizens and legal residents, and that's a fact. So instead of focusing on immigrants, we should focus on citizens. Instead of focusing on problems of adaptation, we should look at racism. And it's common in Europe to say there is no racism. Books by Fatima El-Tayeb, books by Philomena Essed and others have shown that racism is foundational in Europe. So don't deny that there's no racism. There is racism. It's not the same, and it doesn't unfold the same way as the US and South Africa, but it is widespread, it's entrenched, and it works through denial, through arrogance, through obstruction, through stereotypes and caricature. So instead of immigrants, it should be citizens. Instead of adaptation, it should be racism. Instead of asking white people to be tolerant of Black immigrants, we should demand our rights as human beings, as residents, as people who deserve to be treated with respect. And then finally, instead of expecting gratitude from Europe, we should demand respect. And so what you see is that it's not a question of the facts of Black Europe. The facts do not speak for themselves. They have to be made to speak. And what's happened too much in Western Europe is that the framework, the analysis, the conceptual tools have been distorted and problematic. Now, of course, in Poland, there's going to be a development. I assume that there are many Black people in Poland who are citizens. I know for a fact there are many Black people in Poland who speak Polish, who went to Polish schools, like Margaret, who have a PhD. So many Black people in Poland will be citizens. So the issue becomes, what problems do Black people face because they are immigrants? Maybe they need to learn Polish. Maybe they need to get an education system. And what problems are because of racism? And it's not entirely one or the other. It's a matter of focusing on these different issues. And so what's going to be important in Poland is, what will be the conceptual framework for analyzing these issues? Will it be a framework that blames the victim? Or will it be a framework that recognizes there are racial beliefs, stereotypes, and caricatures? And I feel the best way forward will be a framework that recognizes the complexities of these issues and doesn't just blame the victim. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Stephen. I think that's really good. That takes me to my next question. Actually, this is quite interesting to me. When I was reading the book, I noticed there's something you did there. Before you set out what you call 4 dimensions of Black Europe, which are race thinking, racist thinking, individual and institutional pillars of racialization, the Black cultural presence, the Black human presence in Europe. You started with 2 message statements, which there's no you without me, and we are here because you are there. So I was just thinking, when I was reading the book, I thought, well, it'll be interesting to actually get you to actually, to speak to these 2 statements a little bit more. There's no you without me, and we are here because you are there. I think that'll be quite interesting to unpack a little bit.
So let me try to speak to those issues just a moment. I want to watch my time so I don't go over too much.
That's fine. We're going to be on time. Yeah, it's okay.
So the phrase "there's no you without me" is Black people, Africans in the diaspora, saying to Western Europe, saying to the colonizers in Britain and France and Spain and Portugal and the Netherlands and Germany, saying, you think you developed your industrialization on your own. You did not develop it without exploiting our land and our labor. So there is no industrialization without the involvement of Africans and Black people. You think you developed your literature and your education, but you didn't develop it in a vacuum. You developed it in opposition and in caricature of African people. Toni Morrison wrote a book called Playing in the Dark, and she said, everywhere you look, white people develop their values of civilization, of education. White women are defined as beautiful, and Black women are presented as ugly. So when you look historically at all these issues, you see that Western society, Western European civilization, the culture, the economy, the politics of these nations did not develop without the involvement of African people. Liverpool became the biggest city involved in the kidnapping and transportation of Africans. That's how Liverpool became rich. It's impossible to understand the economy of Liverpool without looking at its relationship with Africa. It's impossible to understand the economy of Imperial Liverpool without understanding its exploitation of West Africa and of South Africa. So the question, there's no you without me, is a question designed to ask, how did the nation develop politically, economically, and socially? And this is a question I think that can be asked for Poland too. Let me give you an example. In 2007, my colleague Clive Harris asked me to come to Birmingham to give a lecture on slavery. And I said, why do you want me to come to Birmingham? And he said, because whenever we mention slavery, Birmingham says, no, this has nothing to do with us. It's all Liverpool. So he said, we want someone Black to come from Liverpool and tell them. And I thought, oh, what will I say? I don't know. And everything about Birmingham was slavery. They made the guns. They made the gunpowder. They built the ships for imperialism. They consumed the tobacco, the sugar, everything. Second example, when slavery was legally abolished in the British Empire, the so-called slave owners got 20 million pounds, 20 million, which is now the equivalent of £1 billion. And all the books until 10 years ago, every book said nobody became rich. That money only went to Liverpool and London and Bristol. And then in 2007, Nicholas Draper published a book and Catherine Hoare published a book that showed that the money went to every city and every rural area across England, even to the ancestors of the British Prime Minister David Cameron at that time. So the idea that would not involve that the nation developed independently is incorrect. Let me finish that point with an example from Poland. I've been reading a lot about Nordic involvement and Baltic nations' involvement in imperialism. Slavery created imperialism, but imperialism had a different dynamic. And I know directly that Baltic nations like Poland and the North Coast, like Estonia and elsewhere, and Nordic nations were directly involved in slavery. People may say, no, it's not true, but they don't know because we haven't done the research. And what I would suggest is if you look at Polish history, you'll see that Poland was central to North Atlantic economies. Poland produced raw materials, produced timber. There was extensive labor that was exploited by the Netherlands and by Germany. So what I'm suggesting is if you look at Poland, you'll see that they were central to slavery and to imperialism. And I'd suggest two ways of doing this. Number one, look at production. Look at production. So who provided the wood? Who provided the iron ore? Who provided the raw materials? Who provided the food stuff? And you'll see that directly, indirectly, Poland was providing to Germany, to Netherlands and elsewhere. But secondly, also, when you look at Polish history, you'll see that patterns of consumption are central. So Polish people who smoke cigarettes, where did the tobacco come from? Who put sugar in their tea and coffee? Where did the sugar come from? Who ate rice? Where did that come from? So you'll see that directly, indirectly, these people were central. So that's what I mean by know you without me. Now, let me get to the other issue briefly. In the 1970s, it was common in England for white people to say to black people and Asians, why don't you go home? We don't want you here. And a number of Asian women in particular, and some black people, they argued, we are here because you were there. We are here in England because England, Great Britain, as it developed its empire, was in India, created what became Pakistan and Bangladesh, created what became the United States. All these nations were created, okay? So the idea that black people and Indians, Asians and other groups are in England, it's directly a result of colonization. For example, let me give you an example. My father was from Jamaica. Unfortunately, he's passed. And one day I asked him, why would you leave Jamaica and come to Liverpool, to the rain and the cold and the wind? I could be in Jamaica on the beach, eating curry goat and ackee and saltfish. And you know what he said to me? He said, my father arrived in 1947. And he said, Stephen, there was an advert in the British newspaper and it said the mother country needs you, because Britain lost hundreds of thousands of men during the Second World War, and Great Britain sent ministers, employers to the Caribbean, some to India, less to Africa, and they recruited people. So my dad was in Liverpool because Liverpool was in the West Indies. Now, the question becomes, how does that apply to Poland? And I can't answer that question directly, but maybe somebody else on the colleague can. But the main point is to think about the relationship between Polish people presumed to be white and Africans presumed not to be white. That's how I'd respond to that.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Sorry, Margaret, let me just quickly respond a little bit to one or two things that Stephen said. It's quite interesting that you said towards the end there that, well, the same thing might be applicable in terms of slavery colonization, most especially to Poland. So, and I thought it would be good to actually reflect a little bit on that. It's quite interesting what you mentioned there about Europe's prosperity, not entirely developed from Europe itself, but from outside Europe. And I think the point, which is quite interesting to me, that you're trying to make there, is just the fact that they kind of trajectory, the kind of standards set by powerful European states, namely the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, as well as Spain and Portugal, the kind of standard they set in terms of slavery and colonization. We've seen large amounts of literatures now emerging from Central and Eastern Europe. There are quite a lot of work now being done about colonization or decolonization in Central and Eastern Europe. And we've seen the impact that these countries actually also played in terms of colonization. So in the 30s, we know that Poland demanded colony, just exactly the way Italy had it, the way Spain had it, the way Britain had it. Why? Because they said they needed the same raw material that the superpower European states had. So it's quite interesting that when we talk about colonization, rather than looking at it from just a Western perspective, it seems to me that it's a wide European idea that is actually applied in most of the times outside Europe. So it will be interesting to hear what other members of the panel is got to say. Margaret, over to you. I'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Bolaji. I think that the fact that you explained to the public right now, I think it's important to talk about the contribution and engagement of Poland in the process of colonialism and in slavery, because this is very often an argument to deny racism, that Poland did not have colonies, there was no slavery, and so on and so forth, and to deny the stereotypes that portray in the public discourse, in the language, in the many, many areas of social realm. So I wanted to ask Lexie right now to speak to what Stephen said, if you have any comments on this, but also because of your very complex identity, because you have an intercultural experience. We've heard you're a Polish, Nigerian, American, and so how do you think what Stephen has said, especially in terms of racism and the denial of racism that is prevalent in Poland on a daily basis, both in public discourse but also in everyday life? How is your experience, everyday experience in Poland, related to that?
Okay, so thank you for your question. I agree with everything that Stephen said. And as you mentioned, I feel that the Polish people look for, well, we didn't have a hand in what happened in Africa. And to speak to that, yesterday, I saw a picture of the Polish president in Africa saying that we were not part of colonialism. And because of that, we are now in opening avenues with Africa. And I feel insulted. Like, I don't know how else to word that. But on the one hand, you want to benefit from the sanctity of, I didn't have a hand in this, but what you did to those of us left in this country is in many ways equal and yet more damaging. I feel that anytime you do damage to a child, you do damage for generations that you're really unaware of. And that's what happens with the racism in Poland. Most of the as Stephen mentioned, the ones who were born here, like you and I, there were no protections. There were no, we didn't have, I've been to Africa, I've lived there. So now when I feel the racism, it's like, oh, it's just you speaking. You don't know. It's your ignorance. But as a child, there was no backbone there for me. That education wasn't there. And the racism stung, and it happened on a daily basis. And it continues to happen. So I definitely agree with another point of Stephen's. There is no you without me. And something interesting that he brought about was the hands that Poland has had the luxury of playing without actually taking any of the blame for what happened and the impact that it's had on even its own people.
Sorry, just before we move on, Margaret, sorry, I just kept popping in. I was just going to ask Lexie a little bit more about this being, being an African American at the same time being Polish. It's quite interesting because we know, I mean, the boys, wrote extensively about double consciousness, and we know what it's like to have two identities in one body. It's a big struggle it's been played out in the US and in the UK. But what we don't know is probably, I mean, it's not been really known publicly, is the idea of having three identities in one body. So the idea of being an African American and also had Polishness into it. Now, what's quite interesting about this identities, especially being an African American, you have really this interesting consciousness about your identity. You every day you go out, you live it. And at the same time, we can see also a similar thing in the Polish culture. It's a very strong identity. The Polishness can never be taken away from anyone. It's quite, no matter how much Polish persons live abroad, they cannot, remove their Polishness. So I was wondering, what is it like to be an African American at the same time being Polish? It will be good to actually know your thoughts on this.
Okay, so I'm African American, I'm Polish, and I'm Nigerian. Because I lived in Nigeria for a very long time, I cannot diminish that part of me. Nigeria isn't, for me, it isn't just what the stories my father told. It is the life. I spent 6 years of my life there. So it's the years were my very formative teenage years at that. So it plays a deeper part, and like you said, there are three. I think that on a daily basis, certain situations gravitate towards this, and others gravitate towards this side, and it's kind of how you handle it. Now, when it comes to being African American, I have had the joy and the luxury of feeling the power that it is to be African American, because in Africa, we're just all African and we're just different colors, and it's just that you're African. But in America, being African American, it gives you a different kind of strength. It's something that I wish could transform into how the Polish side of Black people thinks, because being African American, it's like your superpower. The world is against you. That when you go out there, you're going to have to put on your armor, because things will happen and racism will meet you. And what are you going to do when it does? How you will react? Even it's something that when Ferguson, Missouri, it happened, and I know you guys know what I'm talking about, it became a pivotal point where we began to educate our youth on, hey, so today you may leave your house and this may happen. Prior to that moment, it didn't exist. So in Poland, it is kind of the same education that the young Polish people need. And it's one of the reasons that I like to think, with my armor and my strength that I got from being an African American, it is what has led me to want to return here, to teach this, I guess it's a mentality in a way, because it's this armor. And I get a lot of, most of my work deals with children, because they're the ones where, the mom, maybe the dad is not around, and the mom quite isn't sure how to impart that shield and that armor so that that child is protected when they're out here. For me, it's really just, I don't know, it's a subconscious thing that just happens. Since I've been surrounded by racism my whole life. As some of you know, I started out in an orphanage in Gdańsk. So as I studied for things in school, I realized that the back of my head is really, really flat. Why? Nobody picked me up. Well, and so that's how my relationship goes back with racism. And ironically, I say that in Nigeria, we're all just Black. Well, there are grades of being Black. And in Africa, my color, my shade, the fact that I speak the language and act just like them, but look just a little bit lighter, it's a way of, I think it's like reverse racism, but it made me, they saw me as better, even though discrimination happened. It didn't happen quite like it happens in Poland or like it happens in America. Each place has its own I don't know how to write, its own version of racism.
Thanks, Lexie, for this very powerful intervention. You know, I can recognize a lot in what you were saying, especially as living in, you know, being a little lighter than everyone in Nigeria, having lived in Nigeria for some time. I don't particularly see it as a racism, rather than a individual prejudice of sorts, but, you know, it's probably it's not the topic to speak about right now, as opposed to what I experience here in Poland and what I observe here in Poland and in Europe. But I do identify with your experience in both contexts in a way. So thank you so much. For me, it was very honest and powerful and really great. And just sharing your reality with us, I think it's also, you know, a very courageous thing to do. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful. And I want to move on now to Larry and to a macro level more of, because Larry, you've been working in within intergovernmental sector for a very long time, and you're experienced as a training coordinator, working with police officers, judges, attorneys, teaching them how to combat hate speech, hate crimes, and so on. So you've had experience in creating policies as well. So how would you speak to what Stephen had said, and also to speak about to what Lexie has said about her realities? How do you see the policy-making process in Poland in that context? And if you have any other comments regarding what was previously said, you're welcome to do so.
Okay, so thank you for that. I do have a lot to say, but I guess we don't have enough time for that conversation. But I will say one thing. I mean, Stephen just touched a number of points, having grown up in the UK too, probably around the same time as him, and this notion of them and us. So to some extent, he was just reminding me of my background. It's good to kind of be given that reminder. But I would actually like to come back to what Lexie said, because I think this is why BHM, Black History Month, matters here, right? In Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries. Because we don't have that kind of mooring in society, because we're not considered to be citizens, so this is reflecting back to what Bolaji said, it's really difficult to deal with the day-to-day realities of racism, right? So I would say a qualitative difference between your experiences, I wouldn't say Nigeria per se, but in America, is that you knew you had people in the sense of the community who could support your issue. You knew you had resources available. Here in this part of the world, it's either yourself or you internalize it and cope, therefore making it normal. And actually, because we don't necessarily have that broad approach or that broad community mooring, people feel that their experiences are in isolation. So through my work, actually, when I used to do focus group discussions with marginalized communities, so not just people of African descent, but also Roma, Muslim communities, you hear this argument, which is it's normal for us to experience these negative experiences in the banal reality. So on the bus, on the metro, you know, people calling you mujin, people calling you nigger, all of this stuff because they can get away with it, which is why policy matters. And I'll come to that in a second. But it's just the sense that it's interesting when we start off this conversation, people say, well, there isn't much Black involvement in Poland per se. And that's because we don't really know what's happening in Poland. It's not coherent. We all kind of like, I met you, Margaret, by accident through somebody who knew somebody. It's not as organized, which is why community outreach and organizing is actually one of the recommendations I would put forward, that using BHM as the platform to do that. I know we have willing partners to do this, so it's something to pay attention to. So we're not facing this experience in isolation. And I can just simply give anecdotes, right? When an African man who came here with his wife to work, so his partner, and was attacked by 6 Poles, the police who investigated it asked him, what did he do to solicit or to elicit that attack by the Polish people? He was beaten up and left in a coma. Again, blaming the victim. And this is generally the challenge, which is we have to create a different approach and a different discursive or normative framework. So when we talk about my involvement in policy, this is where I take it from. I take it from trying to create strategies for assisting the victim, being more sensitive and susceptible to what the victims are saying to create that discourse. In the UK, this didn't really happen until 2000, really, I would say, with the Macpherson report post Stephen Lawrence. Now what's happened is that there's a whole new culture in place, even though all the recommendations haven't been implemented, but they were a platform for a start. So coming to my experience in policymaking, I have to say, so first of all, I was the only person of color in my organization. So we just get that straight, okay? So the OSCE is not one of these organizations that, even though they're trying to address that, isn't one of these organizations that are not immune to some of the challenges that we all face or we're talking about today. And so when we started pushing our agenda for addressing hate speech and hate crime, the first thing we had to do was go and reach out to victims. So it was always easy for us to find Roma. It was always easy for us to find out from the Jewish communities and some Muslim communities across the sector. So we're not just talking about in Poland here, but in 57 countries, because they have a hate crime report, an only hate crime report. But the one group which was perversely excluded were people of African descent, completely, even here in Poland, right? And so what we had to do was create initiatives. And so I would just stress the one policy initiative that I would actually advocate that has created a qualitative difference because it allowed us to now communicate with prosecutors, with the criminal justice system, with law enforcement, and to, in a sense, to empower communities who are working on this issue on hate crime and hate speech, was the decision of the OSCE in 2009, which was on the hate crime decision, which is MC Decision 909. And I'll put it in the chat for people if they would like to see it. Because that gave, I would say, impetus, actual impetus to addressing this fundamental problem. Because what tends to happen, and we had a conversation around this yesterday on another webinar that I was involved in, which was the action plan for anti-racism within the EU. You know, what tends to happen is that these plans, these legislations are an end in itself. They're not necessarily enforced or executed, not only because there's no real expertise in how to do it, but also because there's no real practice of it. So when you look at the American system, you see strategic litigation being employed across the board to push for those civil liberties and the abrogations. But here, we don't really have that tradition and that culture. So we have legislation in place, but it's not being utilized, right? So this is one of the critiques that I would actually say is that we need to actually start doing so and creating a new particular normative framework in how we do this too, because the tools are there, but there's no real political will. So in a way, a lot of the politicians, or at least institutions, will feel that by creating these policy platforms, they've addressed the problem. But I don't think that's the case. And so when I stress to you that I was the only person of color, it's not irony that we started to deal with people of African descent because I was working there, right? Because it was people coming to me and telling me about their issues. I had access. So that key component of access working both ways is a very important thing, you know, because, you know, ever since we started paddling, one of the things we push is for us by us, right? And I think that's a very important maxim to kind of drill. And to promote, because in a sense, we have to be the ones to push for those changes, simply because, you know, expecting other people to do so is actually reinforcing that colonized mindset and that colonized practice of, well, we have the white savior or whoever coming in to help folk. So it's important to pay attention really to participation for us in this regard. The other thing that I would actually stress is that if you look at the fundamental, because I'm trying to look at what are the fundamental policy developments over the past 20 years and everything at the international macro level. Well, I mentioned the OSCE's MC Decision 909 on hate crime. I also want to mention the EC Race Equality Directive, which is a way of addressing discrimination in public and private spheres in terms of employment, access to services, XYZ. How effective has that been in many ways, right? I mean, one of the arguments that tended, as it was presented as a counter critique to the Race Equality Directive, was to suggest that, I think it's Article 5, which is a positive action instruction, is always promoted as a form of positive discrimination. And what you have with this language is that people say, oh, positive discrimination, so you're discriminating against this, right? You're now creating discriminatory practices and removing the essence or flipping the essence or mitigating or minimizing the essence of that particular thing, because the text actually says it's time specific. And it's no different to the discussion around affirmative action across the Atlantic, where people say we don't need these outdated policies now because racism no longer exists. You know, but one of the things that we talked about earlier, and I think Stephen mentioned it, was Black Lives Matter, or was it Lexie? You know, Black people are still being killed, even yesterday, right, in Philadelphia, or a couple of days ago. So if racism is no longer relevant and there's no need for these wonderful policies, then what is happening is not an epiphenomenal, it's central, and it's part of our cultural identities, where you do have to put on an armor, because these passages, these patterns cross the Atlantic in mitigated, or I would say watered down form. So you may not have the shootings in the streets in Warsaw, but you do have the pepper spraying, right? You do have people coming up and trying to attack you. It's not killing a Black person, but it's still a Black reality. And these are the things that are being denied. And no matter how good the policies are, they don't necessarily touch these things because it's not considered to be part of the, you know, the duties of policymakers, other than creating the policy and then telling people to get on with it. And that's the danger, right? So it's no coincidence that the most, I would say, over the past 10 years, just doing a cursory glance at political discourse, the most, I would say, productive form of political engagement has been right-wing, extreme, intolerant language and invoking of hate speech, right? Demonizing and stigmatizing other people, including migrants. I mean, what does that mean right now? Migrants in Poland. You know, we did a conference in my old organization in 2015 during the crisis, and somebody from Slovakia came and said that they were all foaming at the mouths in Slovakia as part of their political discussion, because there was an election about to take place, about the migrant problem. And then he said, in Slovakia that year, they accepted only 2 people. But this is the migrant problem. So you see a distinction or kind of distance between reality and people's perceptions and fantasies. And it's the same thing too, you're in Lublin, right, Margaret? In Lublin, when I was there a couple of years ago to do training with the judges, you had 2 old men handing out leaflets saying Poland doesn't want migrants. You know, I mean, it's the way to galvanize political interest. Today now it's around gender and women's rights, but it's just part of that whole sequence of right-wing, well, I wouldn't even say extreme anymore, because it's now become so ritualized and normalized that it is now part of the legitimate discourse, right, and debate. So, you know, it's no coincidence that racism has morphed and congealed into other forms of legitimate exclusion. And Donald Trump doesn't help with this in any way either. So that's something I'm hoping we get questions on. But coming back to, and finally talking about policy, the policies that have been put forward over the past 20 years or so at the national and international level have been okay, but people have tended to feel that this was an achievement and therefore there was nothing more to do. And I say that we need to take lessons from the United States, especially from the activities of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and their legal defense strategy, which is we now have to test these legislations by putting them through tribunal, testing them in courts, pushing governments to establish precedents, not just in Poland, but across the sector, including in the United Kingdom, France, Germany. I mean, Germany gets away with a lot of, you know, discriminatory practices directly against people of African descent with their profiling policies, but nobody's taking it to court to challenge it, right? And prohibiting it. And so I think we need to take lessons from there. And on that, I would say we also need to participate in that process in a meaningful way. Not that we participate as guinea pigs or given experiential insights, so that people who are experts can increase their expertise, but not necessarily represent the people or the communities that are facing these issues. And I feel that we need to have a slightly more, I would say, radical approach to this in terms of demanding this engagement and involvement, instead of just, you know, attending conferences and letting people hear our stories and saying, oh my God, we feel sorry for you, but then no real qualitative change that occurs. You know, I mean, it's about time that we have to be more than just a few faces in the crowd, especially if that crowd is supposed to be us representing. And with that, I'm looking forward to questions, so thank you.
Thank you, Larry, for this. It was brilliant. And I see that, you know, we just need more and more discussions like this, but obviously we have no time for them, and they're not very effective, as you say, very often. It's just about, you know, talking and attending conferences. And I really appreciate the fact that you just stated that policies should be actually working, and they are very often just ending at the level of creating them and stating that they are. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I won't take it really further because I see the time is running. So I guess we'll now go to the Q&As. I see some questions in the chat. You're invited to ask questions if you want to. And Bolaji, would you like to take that?
Yeah, that's right. There are a few questions here already, and quite interesting conversation as well been going on in the chat panel. And it's quite interesting. Before I quickly move on to the questions, we've got like roughly just over 20 minutes or so more to round up. It's quite interesting what everybody's actually said so far in terms of the way racism actually works these days. It seems to me that it's very, very global. Because what we see that is actually going on in the US, we see a similar pattern in the UK, we see the same thing playing out in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which is quite good to know that the way to tackle this thing is to actually look at it as a kind of, you know, a global problem rather than the notion that, oh, you know what, racism doesn't exist here, it's over there. So it's really speak directly to Central and Eastern Europe. Stephen, I've got somebody in the audience, Eva, she's got a question here for you. She's asking, do you think that Black History Month in Central and Eastern Europe should be approached differently because the context is different and there is no colonial history these countries have to reconcile with? What's your thoughts?
Okay, let me respond. Let me say thank you, Bol, for organizing this panel. I've learned tremendous things, tremendous insights, and I appreciate it. And the particular issue I just got from Larry, the issue of isolation, I think is a major issue in different contexts and in different countries. And I think it's one to recognize. Okay, so in response to should it be different in Poland, yes, it should be. The way I'd frame it is this: racism is a global issue, but it manifests itself very differently in different nations at different times. And as Larry said, it congeals. I like that way. The congeal catches the kind of negative aspect. So how racism as stereotypes, ideologies, practices, beliefs, the expression of innocence, we had no colonialism, that's going to be very specific in Poland. So you have to look at the specifics. Here's what my recommendations are. Number one, firstly, recognize there isn't a one-size policy that fits every global context. You have to look at Poland as a whole, but also you have to look at different cities in Poland, different contexts. Who are your people? Who are the groups? Who are your allies? Who are your friends? Who are your enemies? Secondly, whatever you do, Black people's voices must be central, must be central. Black people's voices, Black people's visions. And when I say voices, I mean documents, writing, statements, arguments. When I say Black people's voices, I mean art, sculpture, music, poetry. These are all communicating the richness, the variety, the vitality of African and Black culture. Next issue, I would say, if you can only do one thing, you should challenge racist stereotypes and you should celebrate Black people's accomplishments. Not just in music and sport, we know about that, but what Black people have done in terms of science, in terms of education, in terms of knowledge. The reason the UK has significant initiatives around decolonizing education, it's not perfect, but the only reason it has them is because Black people pushed it forward and said, we need to look at broader issues. So if you can only do one thing, challenge stereotypes and promote the richness of Black people's contributions. Next thing I would say is recognize the diversity in the white population. Many white people in Poland are the victims of a colonized education. And when I gave lectures in the Netherlands, many white people came to me and they said, look, Stephen, nobody told us about this in school. Nobody told us about this exploitation. We want to learn. So find people who want to learn. I saw one request from somebody, a father who has a young child. That person wants to know, where do I get information? We are desperate for information. And I think Larry is right on many points. The one point is academics have conferences over and over and over again. It just goes on forever. But meetings like this, seminars like this gets the issues out into the open. So there's different kinds of issues, different kinds of conferences. Final thing I'll say, because there's a lot more, but the final thing I'll say is resources, information, examples. On the internet now, there are massive resources from the US, from England, from across Africa. Not all of it is good, but there are tremendous articles and writings by Black men and women, by Black, gay, and trans. That information is available. Now, one problem, it's all in English. So in Italy, a group of Black women got together and organized something called guerrilla translation to translate things from English to Italian. Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, Bell Hooks, June Jordan. So there are practical issues. The final thing I'll say is this: look at your local context. What's the best thing to do? What's the biggest issue? What do you think you can have more success with? And work from that context. Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Just trying to move on quickly. We've got roughly about 15 minutes more. So, Lexie, this one is for you. Brett is asking, what sort of resources can you recommend for kids? I believe you've seen that already. I think Stephen touched a little bit more on resources. And he's asking, well, does it really worth looking at, Poland, US, compare them, or should we just stick to one?
So I did get with him, and I messaged him to, we can talk more about this offline to not take a lot of time from today's meeting. I think there's a lot, for me, there are a lot more questions that go into what is his daughter's particular situation, because what does she identify with? Where does she live her day-to-day? The advice that a 10-year-old child in America needs, and the advice of the same, on the surface, the same child in Poland, that it's not a one-size-all answer. It is specific. Like I said, in America, we more so have the armor. So if she's proud of her Polish heritage, there's a lot more questions that I feel I would need to have answered before I can give a parent some advice that they're going to use for their child.
All right, thanks very much for that. I think with this next question, I'm going to have to go to each member of the panel just to reflect briefly and quickly. This is quite an interesting one from Kasia. Kasia lives in London, and she works with Polish and Central and Eastern European rough sleepers. And with the work that she does with them, she found out that they, even in their very difficult conditions, they also express racist views despite the condition that they were in. So there's a sense in which, despite the fact that they are at the rock bottom of everything, they still feel that they are superior. So Kasia is asking, this form of racialization that's happening in the UK, do you have any tips on how to navigate ways around this? Just probably I'll start with you, Lexie. Just maybe 1 or 2 words around it.
To navigate rough sleepers? No, not really.
Racist views.
Express racist views. That's a difficult one. That's a difficult one. Let me ponder this. I'm sorry, I was reading a response from Brett right in. So let me ponder it a little bit, and if you would come back to me, please.
Sure, I'll come back to you. Larry, do you want to jump in, please? You're muted.
Yeah. Okay, so I was trying to unmute. I mean, thank you for the question, Kasia. I have to tell you, this is a question that you can just apply to any sector of society, right? So whether it's, you know, people at the top, people at the bottom, wherever you'd like to structure or place these people in these structures. So one of the refrains I tend to have a problem with is when people say we need to educate people, because when they're educated, they won't be racist. And I say, actually, no, because a lot of the people who are educated are racist, right? So how do you address that? You know, so education is not a panacea. So telling these rough sleepers we need to educate them is not going to solve the problem, because there's one fundamental problem that we need to accept, or in a sense, prerequisite with racism we need to accept, is that it's not based on any rational understanding, it's a belief system, right? They have this belief, maybe because they're at the bottom of the pile, they need to feel better than somebody, so that's it. They just tap into what's already out there, these pre-existing normative fields and discourse, and we always internalize it as inferior, almost like the Hegelian notion of master-slave, or Robinson Crusoe Friday, in that binary juxtaposition where black is always bad and white is always good. So even if I'm a white man, poor, blah, 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 sleeping rough, I'm still better than you because you're black. That's always the case. And so what we have to try and do when we do our work is to try and to demystify that process, right? And when we used to work with police officers who had that belief too, which just kind of like, you know, it infringes or impinges upon their objective duties of conducting law enforcement activities. Because a lot of the people say, I think it was Stephen who said it, I wrote it down, nobody taught us how not to, or nobody told us. Okay, so fine. Nobody told you how not to be racist, but you didn't get told how to be racist, but you are. Why is that your primary or default setting? That you take something that's not part of your cultural norms or you know, in terms of, you know, development, but you do take the negative sides in the racial discourse, right? That, oh, black is stereotypically blah, blah, blah. And I've heard this all the time. I remember when I lived in Hungary, the official word for black in Hungary isn't fekete, it's neger, N-E-G-E-R. And we started, it's almost the same as mujin in this country, right? And when we started a conversation on the proximity of the word neger and nigger, people would say, oh, but you know, it's Hungarian, it doesn't have the same meaning. We didn't have this language. They imported neger because it's not a Hungarian word. So how come they couldn't find a slightly more acceptable phrase or adjective to describe the group, or noun or pronoun, right? And this is the point, the disposition is always on the negative side, and we have to start from that position to try and say to them, actually, it's wrong. And this is why the notion of tolerance is given salience in the sense to say, okay, fine, you don't have to like us, but you have to respect us because we have similar rights to you, which is why I like the notion or the discussion around citizens' rights. I don't care what people think about me anymore. I've had enough of that. I just want to make sure that they treat me with the respect I'm entitled to, as I would treat them. And if not, then the consequences will be on them. And I'm not suggesting beating people up or anything, but you know, you can only go so far as having a constructive discussion with people who are always going to deny you and say that you are the angry black woman, you are the angry black man, or you're oversensitive, or you know, it's always this, you know, and in the end, we're always the ones mitigating or having to make the concession in order to survive. And that's part of the problem, is that we have to make that concession. And this is what white supremacy looks like. Because even people at the lowest or the bottom end of that structure can still feel supreme to us, no matter what. My qualifications don't mean a thing to them as long as I'm a black man. And as Chris Rock once said, you know, when he asked a question, and it's in the book called Nigger by Ralph Kennedy, and I'll put it in the text too for people to find it. He asked this rhetorical question: what do you call a black man in America? Nigger. What do you call a black man with a PhD? Nigger. It's the same thing, right? No matter what you personally achieve, as long as they see you as primarily a black person, you're always going to be inferior to them, no matter who that person is. And I feel that's the challenge we have, which is I don't have time to start constructing or re-engaging people in this regard. You know, I'm just caring more about what happens to us and to ensure that we have the protections and the respect and the understanding and appreciation that we deserve.
Thanks very much for that, Larry. Just before we move on, maybe going back to Lexie or to Stephen, I'll just quickly ask you this while we have you on now, Larry. The question for you, somebody was asking, why do you think Polish people are struggling to see and admit their own white privileges?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Oh, I think I partially answered it with the previous question, right?
Yeah,
but,
you already touched on it. Yeah.
Well, because it's not just Poland, though, it's everywhere. White privilege is always being denied because people think it's not a privilege, right? They think it's something, I would also call it enticement to some extent, or an expectation, simply because they think it's legitimate. So they don't see how their engagement in society is actually replicating or reinforcing those patterns of distinction or exclusion. It's in the same way as men, if you just invoke a gender perspective or prism, as men, we don't realize how we actually reinforce those problems or those gender distinctions. So let me just give you an example. A few years ago, I took a delegation of people of African descent to Washington to go and do a presentation to present the issue of racism in Europe against people of African descent at the Senate and the Houses of Representatives. And I've included in the group some really dynamic women and who were really potent speakers. But during during the event itself, we were there for a week, they barely spoke. And on the way back, I sat, because we were all at this Washington airport, and I sat with some of them, and I've learned a lot from these women subsequently. And I asked them, but why are you so quiet? And they said, oh, but brother, you know when brothers start talking, it's difficult for us to speak, so we just keep quiet. And I was like, huh. And I came back and I thought, okay, so what we need to do is create separate platforms, right? One for women of African descent, where they can feel empowered, and another for everybody, right? I didn't create one. And it was quite an interesting development, because in my office at the time, we had people who were assisting me in putting the program together, who were enlightened, informed, and this speaks to white privilege, by the way, enlightened and informed women. And during the event, I left because it's a women's only event, and one of the practitioners or participants said, well, the two women who were not black had to leave. And I was in my office and they came upstairs and said, oh my God, we've just been discriminated against. I think, how? They said, well, because the women in the room who were black told the white women to leave. And I looked at them and I said, so you don't see the irony of what you're saying here, right? Is that these women wanted to have a safe space around race and identity, and, you know, and because I see there's another question about solidarity, and I think that's to Magda. Let me be sure about that. Who suggested that maybe we need to create these patterns of solidarity across different sectors. Yes, we do, but we shouldn't do it to the exception of having our own specific spaces where we can actually have that conversation, because white privilege is actually considered to be part of a problematic to that, because we'll be dealing with contending with people's hurt egos or bruised egos based on that notion of white privilege. And I think it's important to take that into account when we're talking about people of color and representation and participation, because we can't overlook the importance of the symbolism of it all, of us doing it for ourselves, right? Can you imagine somebody, not other than Martin Luther King, a white person giving a speech on I have a prize, or somebody like another white person saying by any means necessary, which we've had, it just wouldn't resonate as much, right? And I think it's important to take all of that into account. So I think the reason why it's not just posed, so Viola, thank you for your question, but I think it's a problem across the board where we have that race or an issue around racial division and racial justice, where you have people who are well-intended, who in some ways have a lot to say, but at the same time don't understand the limits of where the interaction or involvement or engagement should be. And I think that's what privilege alludes to, is that they can take it for granted in ways that we can't. Because I look at Lexie now, when she talks about her armor, I hear this story generally with people of African descent here, that they can walk around 24/7, 360, which is to be constantly on alert because you never know when their attack is going to come and everything. This is not white, this is not a privilege for us, but there are other people who could walk away and not actually invoke that. They could go off to restaurants, they could do things in public, they can get the metro, they can get the tram, with little or no wahala, as we say in Nigeria. So I think it's important for us to take this into account, actually, when we start having these discussions. And yeah, we're going to bruise your egos, we're going to hurt you, but I'm sorry, it's about time that you've come face to face with that reality, because, you know, it is time for us to actually stand up and do it for ourselves.
Thank you very much, Larry. Just this very last question, it's probably going to be one word, 1 minute. Stephen, before I actually go around for close remarks. Somebody is asking, I would like to read more about the role of Poland in colonialism. Any book you can recommend?
No, not right away. Not off the top of my head. But we can find some stuff. If you want to look for it, the way to look for it is to look at books on North Atlantic economies as opposed to Atlantic. The Atlantic economy is mainly about Europe and the Americas, but North Atlantic, there is a tremendous array of articles. Most of these are in English. On Poland, you know, I can't say for sure. But maybe I can send some stuff.
No, it's okay. I think there is a lot of material out there. I've got some myself that I can share with
I'd like to respond to the early question quickly, if you don't mind.
Yes, 1 minute.
Yeah, sure. So this issue of dealing with people who are sleeping rough, I'd like to share a principle that I think is central to every step forward. And the principle is this: you can't start everywhere, so you have to start somewhere. You can't do everything, so you have to do something. You have to choose what to, so you have to have priorities. And I think in that instance with rough sleepers, the priority is not to educate them. The priority is to stop them attacking Black women and men, to stop them racially abusing Black women and men. And if you can help them some more, you can help them some more. And Black people, their priority, our priorities, is not dealing with rough sleepers. Some of us are rough sleepers. Our priorities are jobs, education, health for the children. But if we're walking home and a rough sleeper wants to attack us, then it becomes a priority. So you can't start everywhere. You have to start somewhere. You have to have priorities. No, you've gone silent.
Thank you, Stephen. And we're going to be closing now with some closing remarks. And so I will ask Lexie to just, you know, really a few words to say at the end, and then Larry, and then Stephen. Thanks.
So first of all, I would like to thank everyone for participating in this type of a discussion. This has been very, very informative for me. Having just the opportunity to speak with some of you, your level of education on the topic. Like Margaret, the first time I saw your qualifications, it's just amazing that you all have put so much of yourselves into this. You've made careers of this, and it's just amazing that you're trying to pave a way for better. And like Stephen says, we're not going to fix everything. So we just have to start somewhere. And I'm so thrilled and honored to be part of what I think is the start or the beginning of. Thank you.
Thank you, Lexie. Thank you for kind words as well, Larry.
Yeah, I just also want to echo what Lexie said, and also thank you, Bolaji and Margaret, for putting this together. I recall a few weeks ago when you came up with the idea, how I thought it was actually something that would be necessary, at least as a start, or as a continuation, I would say, because similar conversations have taken place. And, you know, if not for COVID-19, we probably wouldn't be doing it this way. We'd probably have a meeting and it would be much more isolated, because then it becomes locally specific. The fact that we can have many people joining us from afar makes it, I think, a really useful exercise. And I'm hoping that we continue to do so. And I'm hoping that we all stay in touch, because even if we have different approaches, I think that's what we need, right? Those different perspectives to try and find, you know, specific solutions to the specific issues. Because as Stephen said, you can't start everywhere, but you want to make sure you have an impact everywhere, right? So let's see how we can do that. So thank you very much. And, you know, I hope you continue this.
Thank you. I think diversity within is also crucial. And Stephen?
Okay, yeah, I'd like to join Larry and Lexie in saying I appreciate having been invited. I commend and applaud you for putting this together. I hope it's going to get the ball rolling further and further as you continue. I wish you strength. I wish you motivation. I wish you colleagues and allies. And I'd say one final thing, which is I'm trying to encourage a lot of people in Britain to declare February the second Black History Month in Britain, and to engage with African Americans who have a wide array of activities, not enough for what they deserve, but still far more than Europe. And I would encourage you that there will be far more activities in the United States in February. My own department is organizing a celebration of Barbara Christian, who was a Black feminist analyst and the first Black woman to become a full professor at Berkeley. And there'll be a lot of other things. So I'd like to encourage you that we don't just wait for another 11 months until next October, but we continue. So I wish you success, and I look forward to being in touch with everyone again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ivan, I think I will pick on what you said before, that every month should be a Black Achievements Month. So we'll probably start from today. Thank you. And thank you all speakers for being here, for accepting invitation, and for all the attendees for being so patient and also engaging in the discussions, for all the comments that you've put in the chat. As we said, we'll try to stay in touch, and we'll try to connect all the speakers together, and then you can also reach out to all of them, because the emails are available as well in public internet spaces and social media, etc. And thank you, Bolaji, as well, for initiating actually this event, and for reaching out to me and saying, hey, Margaret, we should do something on Black History Month in Poland. So I'm really grateful for that. And yeah, I hope you all stay safe. And yeah, I'm passing now to Bolaji for the final word. Thanks.
No, I think that's it. Everything has been said. We're so grateful to have everyone on. Hoping that this is going to move on the conversation from here, and it will give more people the platform to move this, on to the next stage. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a very good evening. See you later. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Thanks.